November 14th edition of the show. And I just got back from Poland, spent most of the week in Poland, having traveled there from Budapest, Hungary, last week to attend the Polish Independence Day March of 2019. This is the big patriotic march to celebrate Poland's independence from back in 1918. Of course, Poland ceased to exist as a country for about, I think it was about 123 years before that. So we got to march with the apparent extremist far right, as the media has denounced and decried them for years and years and years. Turns out they're not actually that extremist, that far right at all. It was mainly, from what I saw, patriotic families fighting for the future of their country, fighting to avoid the same fate as Western countries in terms of the revolt against globalism. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about Europe in general. We've got massive problems with grenade attacks in Sweden. We've got more terror attacks in France. We have a situation in the Netherlands where the Islamic call to prayer is now being blasted out. People are revolting against that. The Vox party in Spain, the populist party, is more successful than ever before. So we've really got a lot of positive news today regarding the revolt in Europe against globalism. But we spent about 4 days in Warsaw, Poland this week, not only marching on the Independence March, but meeting with members of parliament. We actually got to visit, we're shown around the Polish parliament yesterday, because there's a new federation, there's a new coalition of populist right-wing parties that in the recent Polish election, which took place, I think, as recently as last week, won 11 seats in parliament, and now they are going to be able to push back against the more centrist conservative party in Poland, the ruling party. They call it the Nationalist Party, but it seems to be getting less nationalist and more globalist by the day, similar to the Conservative Party in Britain, which of course led to the creation beforehand of UKIP as a more populist pressure party, and then the Brexit party with Nigel Farage. So we have a lot of similarities taking place in Poland. We got to meet Janusz Korwin-Mikke, who of course became a very controversial figure last year when he did a UK TV interview. He had his opinions, his thoughts completely misrepresented. We got to meet him. We got to meet Krzysztof Bosak, who is also a newly elected member of parliament in Poland as part of this they call right-wing coalition. And of course, we got to meet Grzegorz Braun, who is also a member of parliament. So big things happening in Poland, and they were very hospitable, very interested to work with the media world, the online world coming out of the United Kingdom and the United States. So many exciting projects planned for that. But to just give you an idea of how this has been misrepresented by the media, this is their National Independence Day. They have a march every year to celebrate Poland, to celebrate patriotism, to celebrate families, a form of resistance against the globalism, the cultural impositions that are being foisted on the West in many other countries. And how does the media portray it? We have a headline out of Vice: "Bigotry and fear filled Warsaw streets on Polish Independence Day." Really, I was right in the middle of it, marched with them for about 5 hours, didn't see much bigotry, certainly didn't feel any fear whatsoever. It says on Monday, a crowd of thousands celebrated the national holiday by taking aim at Jewish people, Islam, abortion, and the LGBT community. Now, to get this right, there are 150,000 people on the streets. The vast, vast majority of them were just patriotic, family-loving, country-loving Poles. Were there tiny pockets of actual right-wing extremists wearing Nazi memorabilia and things like that? Yes, but in comparison to the vast majority, it was minuscule, absolutely minuscule. And many of these Poles carrying banners were carrying banners that said they were against fascism, they were against communism, they were for Poland, for the territorial sovereignty, and against the European Union. That's why they're being attacked by the media. The article says, in recent years, Poland's Independence Day celebrations on the 11th of November have increasingly become a show of far-right extremism. Again, I did not see with my own eyes any far-right extremism whatsoever. This year's edition was no different. with the largest events again organized by extreme right-wing and nationalist groups. Recently, Polish voters reinstated the Law and Justice Party. That is the mainstream nationalist party. They call it nationalist, but it's really centrist, whose campaign was largely based on protecting Polish values by furiously attacking LGBT minorities. Goes on to say the gathering in the center of Warsaw kicked off with a prayer, God forbid, because of course this is an overwhelmingly Catholic country. The media absolutely hates that. Before organizers addressed the crowd. From the podium, Robert Bakowicz, head of the Independence March Association, and a former district head of the far-right National Radical camp, said there is no Polishness without Catholicism. How dare he? Before making anti-Semitic claims. From what I heard from the translation, there were no anti-Semitic claims. There is an issue in Poland, which is a lot of countries in Europe have this issue, whereby Jewish people who have inheritance and no family to pass it on to, certain lobby groups within Poland are trying to get that money sent to Israel, but Polish people want the money to stay within the country. Is that anti-Semitic, or is that merely protecting the interests of your own country? We met members of the Warsaw Resistance Uprising. A 90-year-old woman who was a member of that. Was she a neo-Nazi too? We met people carrying banners with the swastika crossed out saying they were against fascism. And here's Vice demonizing them as neo-Nazis. The article continues, the crowd's hateful chants took aim at a range of perceived enemies, from communists, leftists, and Muslims to the LGBT community. Well, no, what they were chanting about mainly is the fact that Poland, the main party in Poland, the ruling party, has introduced a law which basically says you can't propagandize sexually or you can't encourage children to have sex. It's an anti-pedophilia law. The European Union is now railing against that. Apparently, to oppose that is to attack the LGBT community. I think honest people within the LGBT community will really want their movement, their rights, or what they represent linked with pedophilia, which is what this Polish law actually tackles. And I'm going to get into that on the other side. But the article continues. At one point, a group of counter-protesters from the anti-fascist group Citizens of Poland attempted to block the march, didn't see them, basically saw no counter-protest whatsoever in the area that I was in. Again, 150,000 people marched. Later, a guest of the organizers, discredited American psychologist Paul Cameron, told the crowd, brave Poles saved Europe from Islam. Now they will save it from the deadly LGBT invasion. Yes, there was a lot of chants against LGBT because they see what's happening in America, in Sweden, in many other European countries with drag queen story time and this effort to impose in the culture war not just a respect for LGBT people, not tolerance of LGBT people, but actual sexualization of children. And that's part of what they were marching against. We're going to get back into it more on the other side. Breaking news at summit.news. So Vice magazine and much of the mainstream media demonized the Polish Independence Day march by calling it, in their words, a display of bigotry and fear. I was there amongst the 150,000 marchers in Warsaw, did not see much evidence whatsoever of bigotry and fear. I just saw a huge mass of people, families, young and old, celebrating their country and embracing its true ideals, celebrating Catholicism, their faith, huge banners of Jesus Christ everywhere, people dressed up in military gear, again, to celebrate Poland's independence and reformation as a country, which didn't exist for over 100 years before that. But of course, what does Vice show in their photos? They show, oh, scary weapons being carried by men in military uniforms. Yes, it's a celebration of Poland's military history. What do you expect? You know, there were hussars on horseback. It was really good. The energy was great. People flying flares. People really united, bonded together in love of patriotism and opposition to globalism. They carried anti-EU flags. They carried a flag of Poland throughout the whole march, which looked like it basically went on for a mile. You were watching it at the end of the march as the people carrying the flag march through the field, which was the site of the end of the march. And it literally went on for about half an hour, this flag going through the field with no signs of it ending. So an absolutely fantastic few days in Poland. Met a lot of great people there who were fans of Alex Jones, fans of InfoWars, fans of what we do. We had a great meetup afterwards. And then, of course, we were lucky enough to get a tour of the Polish parliament from members of the new coalition, the new federation, they call it, of populist, quote, right-wing groups that have now been elected to parliament. They've got 12 seats in parliament. And one of the issues they're going to be pushing, having seen what's happened in the West, in America, in many European countries with this drag queen story time, with the increasing effort to make sexual education in schools applicable to younger and younger children. In the UK now, in some schools, children as young as 5 are being pushed, having forms of sexual education pushed on them. Polish people, Poland in general, despite the fact that in comparison to countries like Sweden, which there you see recently granted the equivalent of $175,000 to directly from the government fund drag queen shows for children. They're using the inheritance money from people who don't have family, don't have anyone to pass it on to, basically stealing that money for the purposes of propagandizing LGBT propaganda, sexualization of children. That's happening in Sweden. Polish people are absolutely dead set on not allowing that kind of propaganda to infiltrate their own country, which is why we have this policy being pushed in Poland by the new coalition parliamentarians. And there's a headline out of Reuters: Polish lawmakers vote for bill criminalizing promoting underage sex. Again, how dare they promote a piece of legislation that discourages pedophilia? How dare they? Polish lawmakers on Wednesday voted in favor of a bill to criminalize the promotion, this is a direct quote from the bill, the promotion of underage sexual activity, in a move seen by some as a government effort to court conservative support, which outraged liberals who say the bill aims to ban sex education. It doesn't seek to do that. In fact, there's a quote from the bill directly in this second article, which is out of Euronews. It says MEPs vote to condemn Poland's anti-sex education bill. So members of the European Parliament, globalist members of the European Parliament, have voted to condemn a bill in Poland which they believe will criminalize sex education in schools. This is what the actual text of the bill says. Anyone who promotes or approves sexual intercourse or other sexual activity by a minor, keyword there being minor, a child, in connection with performing the position, occupation, or performing activities related to upbringing, education, healthcare, or care of minors, or operating on school premises, is liable to imprisonment up to 3 years. So they literally just wrote a bill that says you can't encourage children to have sex illegally with pedophiles, and now members of the European Parliament have voted to condemn it. The Polish government insists this legislation is to protect vulnerable children from pedophilia. This paragraph under the header "Stop Pedophilia," this law doesn't speak about any education issues. It only prohibits promoting pedophilia, Polish MEP Beta Kemper insists. However, MEPs, globalist MEPs of the European Union disagreed. And in fact, they voted 471 in favor and only 128 against, condemning a bill which solely discourages promoting pedophilia in schools. Is it any wonder why more and more Polish people are out on the streets talking about not wanting this LGBT agenda pushed on their school children, when in many cases it's characterized as actually promoting pedophilia, as we've seen with the drag queen story time, several members of which, these drag queens, were not getting background checks, were being allowed around children, and in a couple of cases in Houston, as we covered, were actual child sex offenders, actual pedophiles, being allowed into libraries and schools to talk to children about their lifestyles. Polish people are out on the street saying, no, we don't want to be like that. We don't want to be like Sweden. We don't want to be like the UK, where kids as young as 5 are being taught about sex education. Now they're being demonized as racists, bigots, and right-wing extremists. And MEPs are voting to condemn it. Absolutely incredible. But just the sheer energy, the sheer authenticity of what I saw in Warsaw was very, very uplifting. And that's the thing. You just don't see that in the UK. In the UK, there have been cases where people who simply try to fly the British flag on their own property get threatening letters from local government telling them to take it down because it could offend minorities and other people who live in the area. And then if they don't take the flag down, the flag of their own country, which is being flown on their own property, in some cases, other residents nearby tear it down. So yes, Poland sees what's happening in Europe. They see themselves as the vanguard of a new revolt against globalism. And many young people at this march, by being involved in this, by being so patriotic, wanting to protect their country, are living lives of authenticity and meaning. This is the thing. This is the same thing I saw in Hong Kong. In the West, we're beset by nihilism, atomized societies where people don't even talk to each other anymore, don't even talk to their neighbors, are told that they should be ashamed of their country, ashamed of their history, ashamed of their skin color. But in places like Poland, that backlash is really starting to brew. And we've seen it in Hungary and other places as well. So we're going to go back to Poland, it looks like, in 4 or 5 months' time, and really talk to more of these MPs and try to help them get the message out, try to rally around this populist, patriotic message that seeks to restore faith, family, and reason in a clown world, which has now come to the point where literally, as I said before, in Sweden, they're taking the money, the inheritance money from their own citizens and directly funding through government programs, drag queen story time, where these drag queens, many of them not background checked to be around children, are literally being allowed to propagandize their increasingly bizarre lifestyles to our children. Poland is rejecting that in droves. Don't go away. We'll be back.